And what I'd like to talk about is really the background to Luther's protest. This year is the 500th anniversary of Luther's protest, which started the whole movement before the Protestant Reformation. The anniversary is the 31st of October, today is the 31st of October 1517. And I would really like to introduce you to the background of this very important event, obviously. And so we come to Luther at the end. I'm not going into the whole history of the, not even the Lutheran Reformation, but really want to introduce you, hopefully give you a better understanding of how this all unfolded. If you want to read more about this period, there are two books I recommend in particular. They are the first two items on the bibliography. If you want to read on the Reformation, the book I'd really recommend to you is Ewan Cameron's The European Reformation. It is really an excellent, very well informed and well written, history of the Reformation. It replaces certainly the shorter and older work by Owen Chadwick, and also takes into account more recent trends and in Reformation scholarship. Cameron is a secular historian. I'm not aware that he has any religious or confessional affiliation, which is, I think, an asset here because he can look at the events at a certain distance, from a certain distance. Then the other book I'd recommend to you is on, what we call early modern Catholicism. In fact, the bibliography I gave to you is entitled Early Modern Catholicism. This is a title, a label that was really proposed by an American Jesuit historian, O'Malley, because the previous titles or classifications of this period really focused too much on the Reformation and the Catholic response to it, the Counter-Reformation. So you see some historical accounts with the title Reformation, Counter-Reformation, or Catholic Reformation, Catholic Reform. There's a whole debate about this into which I cannot go at this moment. But essentially, there were lots of other things happening at the time in the church, in the Christian world, that had very little to do with what was starting in quite a remote corner of Germany. In fact, there was the great expansion of Catholicism with the European discoveries and colonizations. That led to a great missionary expansion of Catholicism. There were reform movements within the Catholic Church that were really very dependent of the Protestant Reformation and were kind of galvanized by it, but had their origins really in very different contexts. So, in a nutshell, there was a lot going on that really cannot fall under the heading of reform and or Catholic Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation. Hence this more generic title, a bit more adequate one, Early Modern Catholicism. And the best introduction to that, in my view, is Robert Byerly's The Refashioning of Catholicism. That's the second item on your bibliography. It's quite a slim book, actually. It's not very long, but a very good introduction that takes you then to the Council of Trent and its aftermath. So, essentially, I'd like to address, 3 points. First, I'd like to give you a general overview of the late medieval church. Secondly, I'd like to address more specifically movements of reform. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about Luther's protest of 1570. So first, the late medieval church, a general overview. The Reformation was a profound religious transformation that changed European society and still has a worldwide impact. It certainly shaped the modern world very profoundly. And it's important to be aware that it was an internal transformation. It was not an external assault. It was not really triggered by external pressures or external attacks at the time. So if you want to understand the Reformation, we must look at the late medieval church. And in recent decades, in the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a very strong revisionist current in historical scholarship. Up until the 1970s and 1980s, there was kind of accepted narrative that saw the late medieval period as a period of decline and decay, with the idea that everything was kind of ripe for Luther and the Protestant Reformation. In a sense, it was almost inevitable that such a great sort of reaction came to a church that was really quite, well said, decadent and in decline. Now, the revisionist historians working on this period have quite successfully challenged all these certainties about the late medieval Catholic Church. And in general, they have questioned what we call a teleological narrative in history. I mean, teleology can mean different things in different contexts. When we speak about a teleological narrative in history, we mean a kind of historical narrative where you have an aim in mind and you see everything, sort of historical events really unfolding in such a way that they sort of move towards that particular aim. So a lot of late medieval Catholicism used to be read as kind of being already on track to triggering the events of the Protestant Reformation. Now, in general, such a teleological narrative should be avoided in any historical period. In a sense, we cannot avoid looking at a historical period with hindsight and retrospect. Of course, we know the outcome, so we tend to see in the unfolding of events a kind of force that moves to this particular outcome, and that is by no means necessary. I mean, history doesn't follow the laws of nature, but there's always human free will involved, and things could have turned out very differently if only a few circumstances had been different, or perhaps if people had made different decisions. So this teleological narrative is really to be avoided when we look at the late medieval church. Was there a waning or an autumn of the Middle Ages? There was a Dutch historian of art, Johann Huizinga. I think hopefully his title is on the bibliography, Huizinga, who spoke in a very influential work about the autumn or the waning of the Middle Ages, sort of life being drained out of a civilization. And there certainly was a sense of crisis in the late medieval period, in the 15th century. Some of these factors were not religious at all, but had to do with, well, for example, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century. About a third of the population died from it. There was the Papal Schism, which was only resolved in the year 1415. So for some time you had two contenders for the papacy. At a certain period towards the end of that schism you had even three. That was only resolved at the Council of Constance in 1415, and that was a very profound crisis, because the Pope was not only the spiritual leader of Christian Europe, but also had a lot of very real political power in those days. And European nations were actually divided in their allegiance to one or the other contender for the papacy. We had the 100 Years' War between England and France, a conflict that went on for, in fact, more than 100 years and caused a lot of damage on both sides. So you had, there was a certain sense of crisis. This is the period in which also the representations like the Danse Macabre emerged, the dance of death, where you see sort of the death in the form of human skeletons being dressed in such a way that they represent all states of society up to the emperor and the pope, so death as the leveling force, the great equalizing force from which no one can escape. There was all that, but there was also, and continued to be, a great vitality of ordinary religion. Religion really on the level of local parishes, communities, monastic institutions, religious orders, that continued. In fact, the church was quite successful in that period in its primary role, that is the salvation of souls and the pastoral care of the people. And it wasn't really challenged in that role. Where difficulties came in was where the secondary role of the church was concerned, and that was the really strong entanglement between the spiritual and the temporal sphere. You can't really, in this period, speak of sort of sacred and secular, because it was really very much entangled, part of one complex reality. And that meant that spiritual and temporal concerns often went hand in hand. And that had a lot of economic and financial implications, some of them being taxes. It's interesting, it probably has been done already, to see history as a history of taxation, because taxation has always been a big issue and one that could create a lot of conflicts. The papacy imposed quite significant taxes and fees for its transactions throughout Europe. That was income that was needed for the papal curia, for the papal states. The papacy at that point had probably the most highly developed bureaucracy of the age, and actually bureaucracy for us has a kind of negative connotation. In that period, it was actually a sign of progress. It was actually a sign of sort of advanced organization if you had a functioning bureaucracy, and the church was actually ahead of the sort of nations and other realms of the time in having for a time quite an efficient bureaucracy, but that needed income. So for any sort of transactions, services, the papal curia actually claimed fees and taxes. Also, for appointments to benefices, essentially appointments to bishoprics and to abbeys, there was a fee involved. That could then be abused, especially with phenomena like absenteeism and pluralism. Now, absenteeism means that a cleric, usually a bishop, who holds a certain ecclesiastical office, say bishop of a certain diocese, would hardly ever set foot in that particular diocese, but rather spend his time perhaps at the royal court or at the papal court, the papal curia in Rome. So absenteeism. Pluralism in this specific context means an ecclesiastic holding several offices, so several bishoprics, being bishop of several dioceses, which is against canon law, so you need a dispensation for it, which was given for a very substantial fee. So bishops, usually coming from the aristocracy, would pay enormous fees to the papal curia for receiving the dispensation to be able to be bishops of several dioceses. Doesn't mean that they neglected their pastoral duty. In fact, some of these bishops who will never set foot in their diocese or had several benefices appointed very competent men in their stead. There was a vicar general or an auxiliary bishop looking after the diocese and actually providing for it quite well. But still, in terms of canon law, it was a breach that obviously caused bad impression. And there were conflicts with the emerging nation states. This is the period where really the idea of the nation state evolves much more strongly. It started above all in England and France, so the idea that a ruler, king or prince would have sovereignty over a particular territory, which had then a specific national identity. The situation was very different on the Italian peninsula and also in Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. But with England and France, you certainly had powerful nation states emerging, and these monarchs also wanted control over the church in their territory. So the King of England in the Middle Ages, later Middle Ages, had significant control over the church in his kingdom, especially regarding appointments. So it's largely these sort of financial, fiscal aspects that caused controversies. Was the papacy entitled to levy taxes directly on people in England, for instance? Then the church became a very extensive owner of land. That's a phenomenon known as mortmain, the dead hand. So, see, in feudal practice, the nobility would hold land as a grant from the king in return for service, for example, service in war, and then they would be given hold of land in the kingdom. And that grant sort of is cheated after or fell out on the death of the holder. In the case of the church, the land was actually held by, say, religious orders or a diocese or an abbey perhaps, which was a legal person separate from the office holder who administered that land, so the bishop or the abbot. So actually the land would be held by a legal person that obviously didn't die, but so the church continues to hold that land and acquired more and more. So the church in many countries of Europe was among the greatest landowner. And that land would not be used according to, say, economic criteria of gaining wealth and gaining profit. So it was kind of, it couldn't be exploited for the same sort of economic dynamics as land held by an aristocratic landowner, which caused a lot of resentment and also conflict. Other forms of conflict were really legal conflicts, sort of lawsuits, questions of jurisdiction. Clerics were exempt from secular jurisdiction, but had their own form of jurisdiction, ecclesiastical courts. So it was these kind of questions. These were the areas where a conflict really arose between, say, the sort of civic society and the church. So the conflicts were not really about matters of doctrine, matters of worship, as say in the modern period, but about this entanglement between the church and the world. There certainly was an abuse of priestly status to the point of caricature. The kind of worldly priest, monk, friar is a staple in late medieval literature. You have Chaucer. But if you look at these texts, what you find is really not an attack on the ordained priesthood itself, on the sort of ideal of the priesthood, but more on the bad examples. The greedy priest trying to attain wealth by amassing mass stipends or particular legacies, or whatever it may be, or the sort of worldly monk who doesn't take his vows seriously. The ideal of what the priesthood of the religious life should be was very much maintained, and if anything, the criticism was that these bad examples didn't live up to it. There was no criticism of, no attack on the ideal as such. When we come to the papacy was certainly in a crisis in the period. The popes had moved to Avignon in the early 14th century, in 1309, and from that period then the Great Papal Schism emerged in 1378, so the election of two rival popes continuing until 1415. If anything, that weakened the papacy, obviously. And as a response, the movement called conciliarism emerged. So, I mean, conciliarism is a complex phenomenon, but essentially you have three major strands of what it could mean. And in the first place, it meant the demand to hold regular councils, general councils, representing the whole church for church reform, for the purpose of church reform. And if you look at the the sources which I provided, in 115 you have extracts from two documents of the Council of Constance. Council of Constance met from 1414 to 1418. The decrees Hex Sancta and Frequens, they're kind of famous for their claim that regular councils should be held for the purpose of, as it says here actually, general reformation of the church and its head and members. Reformation is a technical term, really. Reformatio is a term in canon law, meaning the insistence on the application of the existing norms of canon law, restoring and enforcing the norms of canon law which existed but were widely disregarded. So in a sense, restoring the form of what it should be, reformatio, reformation. And that was one strand of conciliarism, the idea that you should hold regular councils to get that reform on the way. And again, if you look at most of these reform points really concerned the kind of secondary role of the church, where the church was really vulnerable at the time. Now, this is one form of conciliarism. A second form of conciliarism really advocated a corporate government of the church, the Pope and the body of cardinals together, seeing the body of cardinals, the kind of senate of the church. The medieval papacy had developed in such a way that it was really a papal monarchy that emerged, especially with Gregory VII, Innocent III, and so on. And the third strand of conciliarism actually affirmed the superiority of the council, but really only in a situation of crisis, but would sort of maintain that option that a council should be held in a situation of crisis. And you have that expressed in the document number 114, Pierre d'Ailly, Conciliar Principles. Pierre d'Ailly was a theologian at the University of Paris, one of the eminent members of that university at the time. And this was still in the time of the papal schism, so this wasn't just a theoretical question, this was a very real one. At that time you had three different contenders for the papacy, each claiming to be the legitimate pope, each having a certain following throughout the church in Europe. And Pierre d'Ailly especially considers the question of if, say, a pope were mad or heretical. So what do you do then? Is there any way of resolving that situation? I said it was a very concrete historical problem because you had three different contenders. So this was the movement called conciliarism, and it continued to have a certain force even in the 16th century. And a lot of people in the 16th century still maintained in one way or other conciliarist ideas. Certainly Thomas More did, Luther did for some time until he moved on further. Even the Guise family in France, the great champions of the Counter-Reformation, really also were quite influenced by these conciliarist ideas. So there was some idea of moving towards a more sort of corporate government of the church as a response to the crisis of the papacy. Now, the problem with conciliarism was that, in a nutshell, it didn't deliver. It didn't deliver that reform agenda. It didn't seem to be capable of putting that great reform into motion. One problem was that the Council of Constance was organized according to nation. That was a new thing. Previously, at councils, bishops would just vote, one bishop, one vote. In fact, abbots and other religious superiors were also represented. But that usually meant a dominance of the Italian representatives. I mean, Italy not being a unified state, you have different powers, different spheres of influence. You have the Spanish, you have the French, but still, the Italian bishops would usually have a majority. And to correct that, it was the idea that the participants of the council should vote according to nations. So nations were formed: France, Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, England then emerged as an independent nation, Spain also. This was the time when the Reconquista was completed. But what it meant was that national interest also came into play, and one nation would be pitted against another. It was still the time of the 100 Years' War between England and France. And these rivalries and national interest essentially blocked the reform agenda. So some proponents of the conciliar movement actually switched sides and became advocates of a strong papacy, one of them being the later Pope Pius II. So you see, number 116 is a text from Pope Pius II's bull Execrabilis of 1460, which is a strong repudiation of conciliarism. Really, in no uncertain terms, Pius II rejects the conciliarist principles. And this was the same Pius II who was previously papal nuncio, Enea Silvio Piccolomini, important humanist, Renaissance scholar, actually very favorable to the conciliarist movement and its ideas. But the problem essentially was conciliarism didn't deliver. So the papacy actually emerged gradually in greater strength. Also, the Renaissance papacy it certainly strengthened the papacy. I mean, you've heard about Renaissance. Renaissance papacy is today usually seen as a very worldly period of the papacy, and of course, that is true to some extent, the rise of the Walter family, Pope Alexander VI. But I mean, again, some of this is caricature, and they certainly managed to put the papacy on the map again, and they became the great patrons of culture and the arts. What about, say, I mentioned the kind of ordinary religious life? What about popular belief and devotional practice? Now, in the wake of the Romantic movement, the Middle Ages was often seen as a golden age of Christianity, the age of Christendom, when Europe was Christian, identified itself above all as a Christian commonwealth, and in the 19th century revival that was taken as the ideal, hence even to the point of the architectural, the idea of a church being a Gothic church, and so on. Some historians have questioned this idea very radically. There is the French historian Jacques Le Goff, who speaks of Europe as a virtually mission territory, who sees Europe as only superficially Christianized at the time. There's the French historian Jean Delemore, who has a similar thesis, especially regarding the countryside. He argues that the countryside largely remained unchristianized, and belief in magic and superstition prevailed right through, and it was only through the reform movements, Delemore argues, both Protestant and Catholic, that basically the countryside was effectively Christianized. Both views are really too extreme. It was neither the golden age of Christianity, nor was it a mission territory, but there was certainly a very thoroughly Christian religious culture that shaped life from birth to death. So from birth to burial. And historians have paid more attention to that ordinary religiosity. So not heretical movements, not sort of particular religious orders, but really the ordinary Christianity of the people. And in the later Middle Ages, we have sources that tell us something about this. wills and sort of devotional books that begin to be printed for a wider public. Say there's Eamon Duffy's work, the British historian Eamon Duffy, he largely concentrates on the religion of the people, and it's very impressive what he finds, because he really shows that, as I mentioned already, the church was quite successful in its primary role, in its pastoral care. The sacramental system, as such, was really not questioned. Only the most radical dissident movements questioned that. But it was largely unquestioned. Which covered your life from baptism to your funeral, and everything in between. Popular piety was strong. It was very material. It was attached to material objects or relics, pilgrimages, indulgences that then triggered the great controversy with Luther. But again, we need to look at that with some distinctions. On the other hand, you had movements of interiorization. You had the movement known as the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion, which was very much focused on a kind of interiorization of the faith and the personal reflection, meditation of the truths of the faith, and of living it. The classic work of that is the Imitation of Christ, Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ. And this is also the spirit from which St. Ignatius of Loyola comes from, and in which he then founded the Jesuits. The Jesuits were not founded to combat Protestantism. That was taken on later, but the Jesuits came out of that reform movement that had its roots in the Devotio Moderna, sort of interior, sort of reflected spiritual life. It's a period of mysticism. You have a lot of mystic authors, also women mystics, important. You had a certain flourishing of preaching. I mean, despite kind of Protestant propaganda, preaching actually was quite popular. There were the orders dedicated to preaching. You had vernacular Bibles. Vernacular Bibles existed and had a certain circulation. Not in England, but England is the exception here, because you had Lollardy, the dissident movement known as Lollardy, especially in southern England and Kent, around London. And because of that specific phenomenon, there was a great suspicion of vernacular Bible translations that didn't apply to other parts of Europe. There were actually several German Bible translations before Luther, and they were circulated, they were printed. It was printing started off in the second half of the 15th century. So, and there's also the question to what extent actually the Catholic Church made use of this new medium and of printing, and it did. I mean, Protestants did as well, and it lent a lot of efficacy to their message, but Catholics also did. So my second point then, movements of reform. And I'd like to begin with a longish quote from a book that is on your bibliography, Swanson's Religion and Devotion in Europe, 1250 to 1550. And Swanson writes, "Does it mean that the Reformation, within inverted commas, was unforeseeable in 1515? Probably. Does it mean that pre-Reformation religion was in fact vital and progressing, whatever progress is, rather than decadent and ready to fall? Almost certainly. However, the reformist pressures within the late medieval church should not be understated. They were clearly strong. The Fifth Lateran Council of 1512 to 17 was meant to accommodate them, but in the end failed. Those reformist pressures were not Protestant, within inverted commas, but Catholic. And no matter how different its appearance, the church which grew out of them would have been, by definition, as Catholic as the one it replaced. But the Reformations got in the way, and we will never know what would have happened without them." The important point is there were reform movements before 1570. In fact, virtually everyone spoke of reform in one way or the other, of a reformatio, of a restoration of the norms of canon law, which were widely ignored. But these movements were scattered. They were quite diverse, and they lacked the kind of cohesion that would make them really effective. They were stronger in some parts of the church than in others. They were certainly strong in Spain. Spain really emerged at that time as a unified nation, so the reconquest had been completed. And there was also a strong reform movement coming out of Spain, which then manifested itself in the great Carmelite reform, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, but also in others. Also, Italy had its reform movements. I mean, our own St. Philip Neri came out of that sort of pre-Tridentine reform movement, which in its origins really didn't have anything to do with Luther. And you had other foundations at the time, religious orders, the Ursulines, St. Angela Merici. These were phenomena that were quite independent of what happened in Germany in 1517. When we look at some of these contemporary sources, we do get a very bleak picture. And you have to be aware of kind of cliches of reform or rhetoric of reform. And you really have to analyze it, you have to be critical of that, because a lot of these sources come from people who have some sort of reform agenda. Any reformist tends to paint the actual situation in terms as bleak as possible. So everything terrible, everything decline. That's why we need to do, 1, 2, 3. So you have to be quite careful when you look at these texts. You can't take them as at face value. And even Catholic reformers then after Trent had a certain interest in painting the period before Trent in really dark terms in order to push their own reform agendas. So if you read these great laments of how terrible things are, you have to question them. You can't take them at face value. And there's perhaps little reason to think why the state of the church in pre-1517 should have been worse than in other times. Certainly there were problems, but there are always problems, and there's always a certain vulnerability. It didn't mean that things had to unfold as they did. Also, there's the question of anti-clericalism, which is discussed in the literature. Was there anti-clericalism? Was there resentments against priests, bishops, religious monks, friars? There was, to a certain extent, but not as much as some authors have made of it. Actually, again, you get these caricatures in late medieval literature. Some of them are quite sympathetic, actually. It's shown the human side of the friar, drinking friar, whatever it is. But it doesn't mean that the whole institution of the whole system as such is questioned. There's one document I find quite instructive in this regard, and it's the first one, actually. It's 1.8. It's the grievances of the German nation by a humanist scholar, Jakob Wimpfling of Strasbourg. And this is a list of, obviously, of grievances, kind of denunciation of abuses sent to Rome, expressing concerns of the church in Germany, German Catholics, Christians at the time. And you have, if you look at it, it's largely concerned with that secondary role of the church, so the entanglement between the spiritual and the temporal. So a lot of it is about money, paying taxes, paying fees, so money being sent to Rome, and so on. But what I find so striking in it is the devotion to the church and to the Pope and the papacy that emerges in it. So you have the third paragraph: let therefore the Holy Apostolic See and our gracious Mother the Church reduce at least the most severe of the taxes she has placed on our country. And it says, if that's not done really, then the Bohemian poison can penetrate our German lands. The Bohemian poison, the Hussite movement, the Hussite poison. So along with this list of complaints, you certainly have an expression of devotion and loyalty towards the papacy. And this is only 2 years before Luther's great protest. What about dissident movements? Well, they certainly existed, but to what extent did they really influence Luther and Zwingli and Calvin? Again, it's quite easy to see this in a kind of teleological sense and see and say the Hussite movement in Bohemia, kind of anticipation of what happened with Luther. But there are many other factors that come into play that don't really quite fit here. I mean, the Hussite movement in Bohemia was to some extent a conflict between Czechs and Germans. There was certainly an anti-papal resentment building up, and that led to the Protestant Reformation. But most branches of the Hussite movement, which was not monolithic, in fact, most branches were actually in their thinking, in their theology, thoroughly sacramental. Priestly mediation was not questioned, and in fact, if anything, a sort of purification of the state of the priesthood was demanded. One key event was the execution of Huss at the Council of Constance. Jan Hus was called to the Council of Constance, and the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, assured him safe contact, assured him safety, and that's why he actually went to the Council of Constance. And at the council, he was tried and executed for heresy. It was actually the council, sort of the conciliar movement, that insisted on that, as long as the Pope, one of them at the time of the claimants, was kind of in charge. Huss was protected. It was really the movement coming from the council itself that led to Huss's execution. So conciliarism was in no way kind of liberal or whatever. And that was an event that still cast its shadows into the 16th century, and at some point Luther himself really was quite afraid of suffering the same fate as Huss if he sort of made compromises with the church and the emperor. So especially the broken promise of the emperor to Huss made Luther quite wary. So you had this movement. You had in England John Wycliffe, who then influenced the Lollards, criticized the papacy, the church at the time, also in some sense, but then questioned the sacramental mediation, the whole sacramental system. But it was still quite diffuse what happened at the time. You certainly have heard a lot, and we'll probably hear more about the Renaissance, which is another phenomenon at the time, which in some sense you'd think quite contrasts what other historians have identified as the waning and the autumn of the Middle Ages. So you have this great energizing movement trying to restore antiquity, but as I don't want to say anything really in general about, but I want to highlight one aspect, and that is the recovery of Christian antiquity. The Renaissance wasn't simply a recovery of Greek and Latin antiquity, but also of Christian antiquity. So you had a renewed interest in the church fathers, especially also the Greek ones, when scholars fleeing from Constantinople as the Ottoman Turks were advancing brought manuscripts, Greek manuscripts to the West, which were studied. They brought their own scholarship, their own expertise, obviously, to the West as well. There was the Council of Basel, Ferrara, Florence, which tried to forge a union between East and West again, which failed really in the end. But the point is, the Renaissance humanists did not reject Christianity, but really wanted to also return to Christian antiquity. So there was a renewed interest in the fathers, which were printed with the new printing technology. Certainly was the idea of returning to a simpler form of Christian theology, cutting through all the medieval scholasticism, especially the late medieval scholasticism, which had become very technical, very sort of over-refined, was logic chopping, so the Christian humanists wanted to return to a simpler, more straightforward Christianity, above all biblical and patristic. So Erasmus edited a Greek New Testament. As we look back on it, we find actually that the manuscript used was a very poor one, and his edition is not very good. But at least, his idea was to make the original Greek text available. There was also an emergence of historical consciousness at the time. So one of the Renaissance scholars was Lorenzo Valla. You have his something from his exposure of the donation of the document known as the donation of Constantine. It's document 129. So Lorenzo Valla, a very acute historian, actually showed that the document known as the donation of Constantine, where it is said that Constantine donated the papal states and the kind of overlordship over European kingdom, or over his own empire, and hence of the European kingdoms and reigns to the Pope, was forgery from the 8th century, and he showed that through an analysis of the text through internal criteria, showing that essentially this text could not be from the 4th century. So the emergence of a historical consciousness, historical scholarship in the Renaissance. And then, of course, Erasmus, greatest of humanists, Renaissance humanists, he certainly launched some scathing attack on the prevalent scholastic theology of his time. And was a very good writer, was a very witty writer, ironical writer, and Erasmus, in my view, did quite a lot to discredit the church, discredit religious, discredit priests through his very efficient satire. And in fact, you can say he paved the way for Luther. Later parted company with him. He didn't want to follow him, had some very substantial disagreements and controversies with him on the question of the free will. But in many ways, prepared the way for Luther, because he essentially discredited scholastic theology. He discredited the clergy in general. See, there's an extract from his Praise of Folly, and also discredited the faith and devotion of the ordinary people. I mean, he was great, scathing on the phenomenon of pilgrimage and veneration of relics and all of that. So I said, in many ways, actually, he paved the way, although he then would take his great distance from Luther. I mean, Luther was certainly not what he had in mind. So you can say that certainly these Renaissance humanists in some way paved the way, but still there's no direct connection between Renaissance humanism and the Protestant Reformation. In fact, some humanists became Protestant and followed Luther, Melanchthon, Luther's collaborator, others didn't. So it depended really on other factors as well. How the sort of humanist movement would take shape. Finally then, I come to Luther's protest of 1570. Now, the trigger is the indulgence controversy. Indulgences are, in textbook definition, temporal remission of temporal punishments for sins out of the treasure of merit which the Church has acquired through the merit of Christ and the saints. So essentially, it's obviously not the same as sacramental absolution, which concerns kind of eternal consequences, eternal punishments for sins, but the temporal aspects of it, i.e., the kind of fixing you have to do for consequences of sin in relation to the Church, in relation to others, and an indulgence is kind of remission, either partial or total, of these consequences through a sort of act of graciousness on the part of the Church by applying that treasure of grace of Christ and the saints attached to some particular good work, essentially. So, to gain an indulgence, we go to confession, make communion, and do this kind of good work that is associated with it. Pilgrimage, some particular devotion, work of charity, whatever it might be. Now, indulgences were hugely popular in the late Middle Ages, and the particular indulgence controversy that set off Luther's protests had very unusual background, which in fact was not known at the time. It was not known to Luther. But see, it was very costly to maintain the Renaissance papacy. Much income was needed. And then this was the time when St. Peter's was built, St. Peter's Basilica. So the church, so the papacy, the Pope and his court needed a lot of revenue. And a lot of that came through taxes, legal fees, and bribes. Still, the popes had actually to borrow money from the leading bankers. So this was a period when there were these great banking dynasties in Europe. The Medici in Florence, the Fuggers in Augsburg. Jacob Fugger considered, he was the richest man in his time. I think I read an article recently, if you try to extrapolate that into modern dimensions, contemporary dimensions, he would still be by far the richest man. Had an enormous fortune. Anyway, so these bankers had actually an important function in relationship with the papacy and the church. Now, Cardinal Albert of Brandenburg was a notorious pluralist, meaning that he was Archbishop of Mainz, at the same time Archbishop of Magdeburg in Germany, and the administrator of the diocese of the See of Halberstadt, also in northern Germany. That was against canon law, and so he needed a dispensation for that. And the fee for the dispensation was astronomical. The fee the papacy charged for allowing Albert of Brandenburg to hold all these offices, and of course get the income with it. Meaning having such an office benefice meant a regular income. Anyway, Albert of Brandenburg had to borrow money from the Fuggers Bank in Augsburg in southern Germany to pay the Holy See for that enormous fee. And as part of the security for the loan, he agreed to promote the indulgence for the building of St. Peter's in Germany. So he promoted the publication and the preaching of the indulgence for St. Peter's in Germany. And half of that, or some part of that income, would then go to the Fuggers to repay his debt. Said that was actually not publicly known at the time, imagine if it had been. And the indulgence was then preached especially by a Dominican friar called Tetzel, Father Tetzel, who went out preaching indulgence. And of course, if you consider it strictly theological, you obviously didn't pay for the indulgence, but you made a donation, you made a contribution. But the way it was often popularly seen was basically buying an indulgence. So buying an indulgence for your deceased relatives in purgatory to support the building of St. Peter's. So that was kind of popular perception that was attached to it. And that enraged Luther particularly. Now, but in order to understand his principal point about all this, we need to dig a bit deeper and get into really the theological understanding of grace and merit. Now, who was Luther? Luther was born in 1483 in sort of central Germany, a sort of area that was quite prosperous with mining, was a mining area. Very gifted boy, young man, went into the priesthood, joined the Augustinians, the Augustinian order, became a friar, and the Augustinians actually in that time had experienced a revival, a theological and also spiritual revival. In fact, something I wanted to mention earlier, I mean, you have humanism, but at the same time you have other intellectual strands and movements happening all at the same time. You had a revival of Thomism, you had a revival of Augustinianism. The picture, again, is not monolithic. You had Thomists next to nominalists, Occamists, even at the same university, teaching at the same university. So there are many different strands, and there was also this Augustinian revival at the time. And the Augustinian friars, especially in the province where Luther joined, were really quite taken by all that. And so a lot of Augustine was read, was studied, and Luther advanced, became a friar, and was very strict in his observance of monastic discipline, really on the scrupulous side. He really wanted to be absolutely precise and obedient in his observance in order, well, for his own sanctification, in order to save his soul and sanctify himself. He had a great sense of God's majesty and of his own sinfulness. Now, he was for many years under the spiritual direction of his confessor, Father Staupitz, who was very important in the Augustinian order at the time, also a reformer. And as long as Staupitz sort of looked after Luther, he seemed to have stayed on the straight and narrow path. But there was this scrupulous element, and the question that vexed Luther: how can I be just in the sight of God? How can I be justified? I, as a sinner, how can I appear as justified in the sight of God? This was a question he wrestled with particularly. And Luther taught at the recently founded university in Wittenberg, Saxony in central Germany, where the local prince, the elector of Saxony, had established his own university. And his main task was really lecturing on the scriptures, so he would expound the scriptures. And he would focus especially on the Psalms and on the letters of St. Paul. And it was really through a thought process that, we can trace actually, because his lectures are available, and between 1513 and 1518, that he became more and more convinced that justification, the sight of God, can only be attained through faith. Romans 1:17, the just shall live by faith. Now, you have to question, how does Luther actually understand faith? What does he mean by it? What does he mean by justification? But that was his sort of great breakthrough, and he understood that to be by faith alone. Human work can, in any way, get us into the right relationship with God. And Luther questioned a very fundamental premise of Catholic theology. For that, I have to go back again take one step back, on the understanding of justification and merit. Now, the sort of key question is our relationship with God, my relationship with God. Is it governed by mercy, by pure mercy, by God's mercy alone, or does also an element of justice come into it? So does God relate to me only sort of in pure mercy, because I'm a sinner and there's nothing I could do of my own efforts to change that? Or is there also an element, does God actually engage with me also on the level of justice? So is there actually something I can do to gain God's favor, or to remain in God's favor, however you want to phrase that? And Catholic teaching, still Catholic teaching, has always been that, of course, we are justified initially through God's grace, which is always has the initiative, is always the first element in all of that, of God's God coming to us. But that once we are to respond to that and are justified, are made right, that then we enter into a relationship that is not simply governed by mercy but also by justice. So we can actually attain merit in God's sight by our good actions, by our good works, by our good deeds, by our prayer, by everything we do to live according to God's commandments and so on. Now, it's very clear that this is already the gift of God's grace, the free gift of God's grace, to put us into this, to try to kind of put us on our feet again. But then we are actually able to gain merit in God's sight for, say, good works. We do so, and we do receive a reward for, say, the phrase sometimes used, pious phrase, he's gone to his eternal reward, implies that. And also, if you look, the scripture, interpretation of scripture is complex, but certainly Matthew 25, the great judgment, certainly implies that we actually will receive, we will be rewarded or not for what we have done. And so general kind of medieval theology was very clear about that once we are actually, through God's free and undeserved and gratuitous grace, justified, we can then gain merit in God's sight. Merit that is real merit in the strict sense of the word, which supposes an equality between service and return. So we have a claim to that reward. It's actually a matter of commutative justice. So I can actually claim a reward for the good work, or I have a claim to the reward for the good work I've done, and God will give it to me in justice, not in mercy, not because it's just simply God's merciful love, but actually because it's something God owes to me, always with the premise that it's God's free love that has made that possible, but still something we have a claim to. And that's what's called condign merit as a technical term. So condign merit, adequate merit in the strict sense. So once I'm in a state of grace, habitual grace, I can actually gain merit at God's sight. And that is really the greatest motivation to perform acts of charity, to perform good works, to do things like extraordinary go on pilgrimage, and also the whole indulgence system really falls into that. And that is what Luther really fundamentally rejects. The idea that I can ever gain any merit in God's sight. And he found that really in his study of, above all, the readings of St. Paul and of the Psalms. See, for Luther, it is so Luther says Luther takes that phrase from St. Paul, Romans 1:17, the just lives by faith. And but the way he interprets it is very particular. What he see in the Catholic understanding, once we are justified, we are actually also sanctified. So there is an inner transformation. We actually participate in the holiness of God, and it's made possible for us to grow in that holiness and also to grow in merit. Now, Luther has a quite original and new understanding of what justification means. He focuses really entirely on the work of God and the merit of Christ. And what happens in justification is that I am declared righteous, but I'm not really made righteous in a kind of ontological sense. So justification means God declares me righteous, pronounces me righteous, but sort of imputes, and that's the technical term that is used, imputes the righteousness of Christ to me. So in a sense, when he looks at me, he doesn't see me, but sees the merits of Christ and the righteousness of Christ. And that's how I become righteous. So I'm actually not really righteous, justified, sanctified. But it's just I'm clothed with the righteousness, holiness of Christ. And when God looks at me, he decides not to look at me, wretched sinner, but at actually his own Son. And but there's no real participation of myself in that righteousness of Christ. It's an alien righteousness. It's imputed to me. The Catholic understanding is that the technical term is imparted. So in some sense, I really participate in the righteousness of Christ. And that means that I always remain, as Luther put it, simul justus et peccator. I remain always and at the same time justified and a sinner. So I always remain a sinner. So I can never have a claim on eternal reward. Even if I go to heaven, I still remain a sinner. But God decides sort of not to look at that, but to cover me with the righteousness of Christ. Whereas the Catholic understanding is that there's a real participation in Christ's holiness, which makes it able for us to grow in that holiness and also to, well, essentially gain merit. And so receive an eternal reward. That's then also what's reaffirmed at the Council of Trent. And this, sometimes people ask, so what is the basic difference between Catholic and Protestant faith? And this is really the point where the essential point where Luther started, and which has then enormous consequences for everything, really, for our understanding of the Church, for understanding of the sacraments, understanding of ethics, really, which is kind of separated from faith. Luther in many ways was a child of his time and retained many Catholic practices, and certainly socially was very conservative, and obviously expected a truly Christian person to live also according to the commandments and everything. But he kind of dissociates it from what's really happening in us. And also his understanding of faith is not what is really different from the tradition. See, we are made just through faith, or through faith alone. Was not a new message. I mean, St. Bernard of Clairvaux says something similar, really, in the same terms. But Luther has a very specific interpretation of faith, which he essentially defines as trust in God, as confidence in God. Because Luther wants to remove the human aspect, or the human work, out of the process almost completely. It's all God's work in me. So it's not my righteousness, it's Christ's righteousness which covers me. So it's all God's work, God's activity. So the only thing I can do is have that sort of complete confidence, trust in God's work. So it's not so much the sense of my sort of assent to the truth, or the reality revealed by God to me. Luther really wants to say that it's God's work, and we, I as a human person, cannot really contribute anything to it. And this kind of theology he had already developed in a nutshell by 1517, and so that preaching of the indulgences really provoked him very, very strongly, because that, in his sense, epitomized that understanding that, by doing this, that, or the other, even by going on a pilgrimage or venerating let alone buying an indulgence sheet, could do anything for my salvation. And he published, in response to that, 95 theses in 1517, 31st of October. There's a lot of kind of Reformation mythology attached to this. Sort of Luther nailing his thesis to the door of the church, of the palace in Wittenberg, the castle rather. Now, what is true is that the castle church in Wittenberg was the university church. And in those days, of course, you didn't, how would you publicize something? Well, you put it on a notice board. And so it was true that the 95 theses were an invitation to a disputation, invitation to an academic debate. So theses which were then meant to be debated, were, as would often happen in the university context. So they were published, and probably some university clerks sort of did actually fix them to the door of the church, which was the university church in Wittenberg, probably not Luther himself. But the effect this had was really unprecedented. These were quite technical sort of propositions, but they very strongly resonated. And in fact, they were copied and publicized by sort of Luther's collaborators very, very fast. They were printed and circulated all over Germany, especially in the sort of reformist humanist circles who really soaked them up and popularized them. Because of course, the whole reformist climate, so obviously there was something wrong with it, and this was seen to be the adequate response. And it very soon turned into an attack on kind of systemic corruption of the church, especially the papacy. That was the target from the very beginning. And especially the kind of claims of the church and the papacy in particular, really to kind of, if you like, administer our paths to salvation. And that was perhaps what bugged Luther most strongly in this whole indulgence question. He basically also thought it emptied the Christian life of its seriousness. You buy an indulgence, you think you're fine. So it started certainly with that concern to restore some seriousness of conversion to the Christian life, but very soon went beyond that and called like wildfire. It very soon turned into an attack on the papacy and on anything that really for Luther and his followers gave the impression of I guess to put it in a nutshell, to see the work of salvation really as something in which human effort, one way or another, could collaborate with God's grace. So, masses, the whole idea of the sacrifice of the Mass offered for the benefit of the living and the dead. Obviously, a lot of forms of devotion, devotion to the saints, which was radically rejected. The understanding, obviously, of prayer for the dead in purgatory, and the whole understanding of the church as the mystical body of Christ present in this world, present on earth, which was seen really as incompatible with the gospel of justification as Luther saw it. So I've already spoken for too long, so I can't go into all that. If you read some of the literature, you can follow that up. But that was the event which triggered the whole movement and was spread like wildfire. It was said, as some of these historians really make clear, it was not predictable in any way, and something really erupted here. It was like an explosion that erupted with Luther. Somehow it resonated because of the problems that were existing at the time. But his proposal certainly opened a completely new chapter. Of course, there is some scriptural warrant for that. The whole question of scriptural interpretation comes in, and some of it obviously is a corrective to abuses that did exist, like something called indulgence phenomenon. But it is a completely, in a sense, it is quite a, sort of said, it's something, a radical reinterpretation of Christianity that came with Luther, which has had a very obviously lasting effect, which then continued and developed, say, by Calvin, by Zwingli. But important to understand because it had such a profound effect on the world we live in. So I think I have to stop here because I've spoken for much longer than I wanted to, but maybe we have some time for questions.